Now, I guess I will primarily be speaking to a Muslim audience for the next few minutes when I say that Muslim researchers in particular, they need to become more cognizant of the sources and the biases of our own sources. I think one of the problems that many Muslim researchers have, Muslim academics have, is that they're extremely trusting of sources that they are already inclined towards. And by and large, source criticism, historical source criticism, is really frowned upon from within Muslim circles. And I'll be the first to say it took me many years of my own research, after leaving the Medina environment. It took me many years of understanding the human nature of biases to understand that we cannot just take what 6th century Sunni theologian said about Jahm and accept it as a fact, even if we love the 6th century author, even if we admire him. And one of the anecdotes that well, not the anecdote, one of the hadith narrations that I quote when I teach critical thinking to my own students at the Islamic Seminary of America is the anecdote or the hadith in Sahih Bukhari of the lady who complained to the Prophet ﷺ about her husband, and how he treated her and how he didn't pray and how he didn't do this and that. And the fact that when he called the husband explained himself, we discovered that the lady is not actually lying at all, but the lady has a selective bias. The lady is picking certain things out of context and then presenting them to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we can understand that this can happen to two companions, right? You have selective bias. How much more so when we have intersectarian bias, right? So again, when it comes to this issue of Jahm ibn Safwan, I mean, if you read, I don't want to mention the person because he's highly admired and respected. Let's just say one of the main icons of Sunni Islam. If you read how he describes Jahm, he will say that he was a person of evil, a person of jadal and munadhara. And yet, when you read As-Safadi, who is a more neutral historian and basically somebody who's coming to it from a pure historical perspective, As-Safadi says that Jahm al-Safwan kana dha adabin wa nadharin wa dhaka'in wa fikrin wa jidalin wa mira, right? So notice how he shifts it around. He doesn't negate that Jahm was argumentative, but he says he was an argumentative person, but he was also a person of learning, a person of letters, a person of intellect, a person who would think deeply, right? So notice how As-Safadi describes Jahm, and our Sunni icon, one of the icons of Islam, basically eliminates the first 5 or 6 adjectives and then says he was always argumentative. And maybe he was argumentative. And again, please don't misunderstand this as a defense of Jahm. Not at all. I mean, I have no idea that he had views that are definitely not mainstream and orthodox in Sunnism. So this isn't a defense, but it is an issue of how much should we trust the sources? Let me give you one more example about Jahm, which really illustrates the point. One of the most common anecdotes that is narrated about Jahm, in fact, in my MA, I have this anecdote without question, because that was a different phase of my life, is the anecdote of Jahm picking up the Quran and throwing it on the ground and stomping on it. Okay, this is mentioned by a number of early authors, including Imam al-Bukhari, for example, right? Now, again, this is an anecdote that nobody ever doubts or whatnot. At the same time, let us be a little bit more critical. And this is not a defense of Jahm. If he did this, then this is without a doubt a type of heretical, blasphemy that no two Muslims would differ over. But did he really pick up a copy of the Quran and throw it on the floor and stomp on it? Does that really make sense for somebody to do? In a Muslim land and environment, to have such a level of hatred? Let's look at who narrates this. When we look at the narration, it all goes back to one particular individual, Abu Nu'aym al-Balkhi, who is hardly known as a narrator of hadith. He's barely acceptable, as a narrator. And then he says, an anonymous friend of Jahm's told me. Right? Somebody whom we don't know who that person was, right? Somebody who we have no clue who he was. So all of this story goes back to a person who is really not well known for knowledge, and he's just, like I said, somebody, Abu Nu'aym al-Balkhi. He's there. We know he existed. We don't know much about him. He does not narrate any of the famous hadith of any of the famous books of hadith. He's not a well-known. In fact, he was known for qira'at shadda, which again, a whole different point altogether. Yet we trust Abu Nu'aym al-Balkhi when he narrates from Mr. Anonymous, because it fits our narrative of Jahm. And again, this is not a defense of Jahm, but let us be fair here. Would that hold up in a court of law? Would that be fair? Would we like one of our enemies to say something like that about us with a complete, brazenly broken chain full of, So here's the point: what do we really know about Jahm? That's a very good question, and I think that's where further research will continue, needs to be done. But I agree with you that we should approach some of these tropes with a healthy degree of skepticism, not because we're impugning the character of these great imams and authors, but because when you already have a bias against somebody, it is only natural that a small issue will be exaggerated, and that maybe even a mistake will become something very evil, or maybe even an outright lie is not going to be verified and then passed on by trustworthy sources. So when we call for source critical thinking, and when we call for being a little bit more careful about what our own sources say, this is not at all to impugn the integrity and the character of the great imams and the scholars of Ahl Sunnah. Rather, it is simply being human. If the Sahabi wife and the Sahabi husband, it can be discovered that neither is lying, but it's simply selective, then surely, min bi awla, a fortiori, we should be a little bit more careful when people of different sects and schisms are described in our own books, and Allah knows best.
Wow, so Yasir Qadhi is trying to introduce source criticism. He's trying to help Muslims think more critically about their own sources, about the biases that even some of their heroes might have. I'm not sure, but I think he was alluding to Ibn Taymiyyah when he was talking about a scholar and figure that's highly respected by Sunni Muslims. You can just see, guys, Yasir Qadhi is really trying to change the game. He's really trying to reform Islam. He's trying to reform the way Muslims think, and he's trying to do it through the seminary, through the Islamic Seminary of America, and he's really trying to establish this institution that will create a more balanced Islam for the 21st century, um, as the website itself says. So I'm really excited to see where this goes. I'm excited to see how his views bring more Islamic clarity, because obviously there's going to be a response from the Salafi refuters like Daniel Kekachu, and we're going to see what happens next. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you soon.